Breaking news. It is not the first lie ever told before the United States Senate, and it will not be the last. But what Pam Bondi said this afternoon before the Senate Judiciary Committee may go down as one of the most brazen, most shameless, and most easily disproven statements ever delivered in that room. Bondi declared flatly and on the record that the two-tiered system of justice is over. And yet, if her testimony proved anything at all in public today, it is precisely the opposite, that a two-tiered system of justice is not only alive, but now fully operationalized as the new reality in the United States. Bondi entered that hearing under intense pressure, and minute by minute, question by question, that pressure escalated. This was not routine oversight. This was not ceremonial. Senators came prepared, focused on one issue: whether the Department of Justice under Bondi has crossed a constitutional line, and whether the evidence of unequal justice is now impossible to deny.
Breaking news. It is not the first lie ever told before the United States Senate, and it will not be the last. But what Pam Bondi said this afternoon before the Senate Judiciary Committee may go down as one of the most brazen, most shameless, and most easily disproven statements ever delivered in that room. Bondi declared flatly and on the record that the two-tiered system of justice is over, and yet if her testimony proved anything at all in public today, it is precisely the opposite, that a two-tiered system of justice is not only alive, but now fully operationalized as the new reality in the United States. Bondi entered that hearing under intense pressure, and minute by minute, question by question, that pressure escalated. This was not routine oversight. This was not ceremonial. Senators came prepared, focused on one issue: whether the Department of Justice under Bondi has crossed a constitutional line, and whether the evidence of unequal justice is now impossible to deny. Attorney General Pam Bondi walked into the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing under intense pressure, and that pressure only intensified as the session unfolded. This was not a routine oversight appearance or a ceremonial check-in with lawmakers. This was a confrontation that exposed deep fractures inside the Department of Justice and raised constitutional alarms that could follow Bondi for the rest of her career.
Attorney General Pam Bondi has spent the last few hours fielding questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's been a tense and confrontational hearing between Bondi and Democratic senators so far. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been listening in. Chanel, thank you so much for joining us today. Why is this hearing happening, and what have you heard so far?
Well, hey, Muga, good to see you. So this is an annual Justice Oversight Committee meeting, but it comes after former FBI Director James Comey was indicted by a federal grand jury. So some Democratic lawmakers now accusing the Justice Department of sort of going after people that are perceived to be enemies of President Donald Trump. Attorney General Pamela Bondi, who you see here today, facing some questions about a wide swath of topics, of issues, including her handling of the Epstein files, also the existence of that so-called client list. She was also asked today, Mugo, about the Justice Department hiring January 6ers and the Trump administration's move to deploy National Guard troops to various cities across the country. Here's more on that with Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin and Attorney General Pam Bondi.
From the very first moments, it was clear Democratic senators were not there to exchange pleasantries or accept rehearsed talking points. The questioning was sharp, methodical, and relentless, circling one central issue: whether the Department of Justice under Bondi's leadership crossed a constitutional line in pursuit of political objectives tied directly to Donald Trump. The hearing took place against a volatile and highly consequential backdrop. It came just days after former FBI Director James C. was indicted by a federal grand jury. That timing mattered enormously. It reinforced growing accusations that the Justice Department was being weaponized against individuals perceived as political enemies of Trump. For many senators, this was no longer a theoretical debate about norms or precedent. It was about whether the most powerful law enforcement institution in the country was being transformed into a political tool. Before going deeper, if you believe Pam Bondi should be held accountable for her actions, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with anyone who needs to understand what is unfolding. Now let's focus on what actually happened inside that hearing room. Attorney General Pam Bondi has spent the last few hours fielding questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee It's been a tense and confrontational hearing between Bondi and Democratic senators so far. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been listening in. Chanel, thank you so much for joining us today. Why is this hearing happening, and what have you heard so far? Well, hey, Muka, good to see you. So, this is an annual Justice Oversight Committee meeting, but it comes after former FBI Director James Comey was indicted by a federal grand jury. So, some Democratic lawmakers now accusing the Justice Department of sort of going after people that are perceived to be enemies of President Donald Trump. Attorney General Pamela Bondi, who you see here today, facing some questions about a wide swath of topics of issues, including her handling of the Epstein files, also the existence of that so-called client list. She was also asked today, Mugo, about the Justice Department hiring January 6ers and the Trump administration's move to deploy National Guard troops to various cities across the country. Here's more on that with Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin and Attorney General Pam Bondi. Bondi was pressed on a wide range of controversies that have followed her tenure. Senators questioned her handling of the Epstein files and the opaque status of the so-called client list. They challenged her on the hiring of individuals with direct ties to January 6th. They demanded answers about the Trump administration's aggressive use of National Guard deployments in American cities. Each topic added weight and tension, but none of it prepared observers for what came next. During her testimony, Pam Bondi made an admission that stunned legal experts and immediately set off alarm bells throughout the legal community. She acknowledged engaging in actions that were not simply controversial or aggressive, but unlawful. This was not a slip of the tongue or a poorly phrased response. It was a clear admission tied directly to official court filings. Bondi effectively conceded that she retroactively signed documents in an attempt to legitimize prosecutorial actions that were unconstitutional at the time they were carried out. That admission alone placed her in extraordinary legal jeopardy. The consequences are not speculative or hypothetical. The potential charges tied to this conduct carry penalties severe enough to put a sitting attorney general behind bars for the rest of her life. Attorney General Pam Bondi spent hours fielding pointed questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The exchange was tense, confrontational, and increasingly revealing. At one point, CBS News cut in with live reporting. A correspondent explained that while the hearing was technically part of an annual Justice Department oversight process, it had taken on a far more serious tone following Comey's indictment. Democratic lawmakers were openly accusing the Department of Justice of targeting individuals perceived as enemies of President Donald Trump. Bondi faced questions spanning a wide array of issues, including her handling of the Epstein files, the existence and secrecy surrounding a potential client list, the hiring of individuals connected to January 6th, and the deployment of National Guard troops across U.S. cities. Illinois's Democratic Senator Dick Durbin was among those who clashed sharply with Bondi, pressing her on whether these actions reflected political motivations rather than lawful enforcement. To understand why this moment is so serious, it's necessary to break down exactly what Bondi admitted to doing. According to court documents dated November 10, 2025, and reported extensively by legal analysts, Bondi authorized a prosecutor to pursue politically sensitive cases targeting Trump's political opponents. The issue was not the prosecutions themselves. The issue was that the prosecutor had never been properly appointed under the United States Constitution. When that defect came to light, the indictments were suddenly vulnerable to collapse in court. Rather than acknowledging the constitutional violation and correcting it through lawful means, Bondi attempted to solve the problem retroactively. She signed documents after the fact and backdated them to create the appearance that the prosecutor had been properly appointed from the start. This was not a clerical mistake or a misunderstanding. It was an attempt to rewrite history to conceal a constitutional violation. The Constitution's Appointments Clause is explicit. Certain federal officials must be appointed through specific processes involving presidential nomination and Senate confirmation, or through clearly defined alternatives for inferior officers. These safeguards are not optional. They exist precisely to prevent unchecked prosecutorial power. Legal experts across ideological lines agree on one fundamental point: constitutional violations cannot be cured retroactively. If a prosecutor was not lawfully appointed at the time they acted, everything they did is legally void. No document signed later can change that reality. What makes Bondi's situation even more dangerous is that the Department of Justice itself acknowledged the problem. In filings opposing her position, DOJ attorneys explicitly stated that her attempt to retroactively validate the appointment was unauthorized. That language is devastating. It shows the constitutional defect was known and that Bondi proceeded anyway. That acknowledgement transforms this from negligence into intent. Intent is the dividing line between administrative error and criminal liability. Bondi is not inexperienced. She is a lawyer, a former state attorney general, and someone who understands constitutional law. Her decision to proceed, despite that knowledge, exposes her to some of the most serious federal charges imaginable. Among them is obstruction of justice, backdating documents to conceal constitutional defects during active legal proceedings fits squarely within the definition of corruptly impeding the administration of justice. Abuse of office is another potential charge. Using the power of the Attorney General to pursue politically motivated prosecutions while knowingly violating constitutional safeguards constitutes official oppression. Federal courts take that extremely seriously, especially when it involves the nation's top law enforcement official. There is also the possibility of conspiracy to deprive individuals of their constitutional rights under color of law. Federal statute makes it a crime for government officials to knowingly violate constitutional protections while acting in their official capacity. If Bondi coordinated with others to push these prosecutions forward despite knowing they were unconstitutional, that statute comes directly into play. Each of these charges carries substantial prison exposure. Obstruction alone can bring sentences of up to 20 years per count. When multiple counts are stacked alongside civil rights violations, total sentencing exposure can reach life imprisonment territory. Judges are also allowed to consider aggravating factors, and abuse of a position of trust is among the most serious. As Attorney General, Bondi held the highest law enforcement role in the country. That doesn't shield her, it makes her conduct more blameworthy. There is also potential state-level exposure. Some alleged actions, including falsification of official documents, could violate state laws. State charges cannot be erased by presidential pardon. Even if federal consequences were somehow neutralized politically, state prosecutors would remain free to act. This is why legal analysts describe Bondi's position as uniquely dangerous. The usual escape routes available to political figures may not apply. What began as political controversy has now crossed into documented constitutional violation, backed by her own admissions. Bondi now stands at a crossroads with no easy exits. Prosecutors can decline to act, pursue charges with a plea offer, or seek a full indictment and let a jury decide. Any plea would likely require cooperation against others. The pressure to cooperate would be immense. Life in prison is a powerful motivator. If she chooses to fight, the risks multiply. Juries tend to react harshly to officials who abuse power. Judges tend to impose harsher sentences after trial than after negotiated pleas. The gamble is enormous. Beyond Bondi herself, the implications are profound. Prosecuting an attorney general for constitutional violations would send a clear message that no office grants immunity. At the same time, the political fallout would be explosive. Supporters would cry persecution. Critics would warn that restraint equals complicity. One thing is already clear. Pam Bondi's own actions placed her in this position. The attempt to retroactively legitimize unconstitutional prosecutions transformed political scandal into criminal exposure. The documents exist. The admissions are on the record. The consequences are no longer theoretical. This story is still unfolding. Prosecutors are reviewing evidence. Legal teams are calculating risks. Decisions made in the coming months will determine whether this becomes a cautionary tale or a historic prosecution. What happens next will matter far beyond Pam Bondi. It will define accountability at the highest levels of power and whether constitutional limits still mean what they say. If you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it so others understand what is truly at stake. Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay locked in, because this legal storm is only beginning. As the hearing moved forward, the temperature in the room kept rising. Senators weren't just probing Bondi's judgment anymore. They were testing her credibility. Follow-up questions zeroed in on timelines, signatures, and internal communications, forcing her to explain exactly when she became aware of the constitutional defect and what she did once she knew. Each answer narrowed her room to maneuver. The more she spoke, the harder it became to frame this as confusion or bureaucratic sloppiness. Several senators returned repeatedly to the same point knowledge. When did Attorney General Pam Bondi learn that the prosecutor had not been properly appointed? Bondi attempted to suggest the issue emerged gradually, but committee members countered with emails, filings, and internal memos indicating the defect had been flagged well before the retroactive documents were signed. That contradiction landed hard. In legal terms, knowledge changes everything. It turns mistake into intent. What followed was one of the most consequential exchanges of the hearing. Bondi acknowledged that the documents were signed after the prosecutions were already underway. She tried to characterize the move as an effort to clarify authority, but senators pushed back aggressively. Clarification happens prospectively. Backdating happens when someone is trying to make the past look different than it was. That distinction matters in court, and everyone in that room knew it. The committee also explored whether Bondi acted alone. Questions focused on who advised her, who reviewed the documents, and whether senior OJ officials raised objections. Bondi resisted naming names, but she did not deny that internal concerns were raised. That hesitation only deepened suspicions. Prosecutors cared deeply about coordination. If multiple officials knew the appointment was invalid and moved forward anyway, the legal exposure widens dramatically. Another line of questioning centered on motive. Senators asked why the department rushed forward with these prosecutions despite the obvious constitutional risk. The implication was clear. Speed mattered because the targets were politically significant. Bondi rejected that framing, insisting decisions were based on law enforcement priorities. But the committee contrasted that claim with the extraordinary steps taken to salvage the cases after the defect was discovered. Ordinary cases don't get retroactive fixes. Politically sensitive ones sometimes do. Legal analysts watching the hearing noted a critical shift at this point. Bondi stopped offering expansive explanations and began giving narrowly tailored answers. That change is familiar to anyone who has watched witnesses realize they may be incriminating themselves. Short answers, careful wording, no volunteering of detail. It was a defensive posture, and it didn't go unnoticed. The constitutional issue at the heart of this case continued to dominate discussion. Senators emphasized that the appointments clause is not a technicality. It is a structural safeguard designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Powerful prosecutors operating without lawful authority, violating that safeguard, undermines the legitimacy of the entire justice system. When the Attorney General herself is implicated, the damage multiplies. Outside the hearing room, reaction was swift. Former prosecutors, constitutional scholars, and even some former DOJ officials publicly stated that Bondi's admissions were alarming. Several noted that backdating documents is among the clearest red lines in federal practice. Courts view it as an attempt to mislead, not to correct. That perception alone can drive charging decisions. Inside the committee, the focus turned to consequences. Senators asked Bondi whether she understood that indictments obtained by an improperly appointed prosecutor could be invalidated. Bondi acknowledged that risk. That admission raised another question. Why proceed in a way that endangered entire cases? The answer again circled back to intent. By the end of this segment of the hearing, one thing was unmistakable. This was no longer about partisan disagreement or policy disputes. It was about whether the nation's top law enforcement official knowingly bypassed constitutional limits and then tried to cover it up. That question now hangs over everything Bondi does. And as senators made clear, the hearing was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning of a record, a public sworn record that prosecutors, inspectors general, and courts can now examine line by line. As the hearing moved into its later stages, the focus shifted from what Pam Bondi said to what her words now mean in legal terms. Senators made it clear they were no longer testing political judgment. They were building a record. Every answer, every clarification, every refusal to answer was being locked into sworn testimony. That matters because sworn testimony doesn't fade. It follows you into courtrooms, investigations, and indictments. One of the most damaging aspects of this phase was how methodically senators boxed Bondi into her own timeline. They walk through the sequence step by step. The prosecutor begins acting. The constitutional defect is identified. Internal warnings are raised, and only then are the documents signed. Bondi attempted to blur those lines, but the structure of the questioning left little ambiguity. The order of events suggests awareness first, action later, not the other way around. This is where the legal exposure deepens dramatically. Prosecutors don't need to prove malice or political hatred. They need to prove knowledge and action. Knowing a constitutional defect exists and proceeding anyway satisfies that burden. Attempting to fix it retroactively elevates the issue from misconduct to concealment. In federal law, concealment is often worse than the underlying violation. Several senators emphasize that backdating documents is not a gray area in federal practice. It is one of the clearest indicators of corrupt intent because it is designed to mislead courts and opposing parties about what authority existed at a specific moment in time. That's why judges treat it harshly. It undermines the integrity of the judicial process itself. The discussion then turned to oversight mechanisms inside the Department of Justice. Senators questioned why internal safeguards failed and whether Bondi bypassed or ignored established review processes. Bondi acknowledged that the normal chain of review was not followed. That admission is significant. Internal process exists to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral decision-making. When it's sidestepped, it raises the question of why. At this point, the hearing took on a different tone. The energy shifted from confrontation to gravity. Lawmakers were no longer speaking hypothetically. They were speaking as if future proceedings were inevitable. References to inspectors general, special prosecutors, and independent review processes became more frequent. The implication was unmistakable. This record will not stay confined to Congress. Legal experts watching in real time pointed out another critical factor. Bondi did not deny the authenticity of the documents. She did not dispute the filings. She did not claim forgery or misunderstanding. She accepted the facts and tried to justify them. In criminal law, that distinction is enormous. Acceptance of facts paired with legal justification often collapses when the justification itself is invalid. There was also a noticeable shift in Bondi's demeanor. Early confidence gave way to restraint. Answers shortened, qualifiers increased. At several moments, she deferred entirely, citing advice of counsel. That is a protective move, but it also signals awareness of potential criminal exposure. Committees noticed that. Prosecutors notice it too. Senators closed this section of the hearing by emphasizing that constitutional accountability is not optional and not partisan. The Appointments Clause exists to restrain power, not to inconvenience officials. Violating it is not a procedural hiccup. It is a breach of the foundational rules that govern federal authority. By the time this phase concluded, one reality was unavoidable. Pam Bondi was no longer simply defending policy choices. She was defending herself, and the forum she was defending herself in had just created a permanent evidentiary trail. That trail doesn't disappear when the cameras turn off. It becomes the starting point for everything that follows. By the time the hearing reached its final stretch, the stakes were no longer abstract. Lawmakers weren't talking about hypotheticals or future risks. They were talking about consequences. The record had been built, the admissions were made, and the unanswered questions were now just as important as the answers Bondi gave. What remained was the unavoidable question of what happens next when sworn testimony collides with constitutional violations. Several senators made clear that congressional oversight would not be the final stop. Referrals were openly discussed, not hinted at, discussed. Oversight committees do not bring up referrals unless they believe the evidentiary threshold has been crossed. That threshold isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's reasonable grounds to believe a law may have been broken, and by this point, that standard appeared to be met. Attention turned to independent review mechanisms, inspectors general, special counsels. external prosecutors, the architecture of accountability began to come into view. Bondi attempted to frame the situation as a disagreement over legal interpretation, but that argument struggled under the weight of her own acknowledgments. Courts do not treat backdated authority as interpretation. They treat it as misrepresentation. This is where Bond's position becomes uniquely dangerous. High-ranking officials are often insulated by ambiguity. Here, ambiguity is gone. The documents exist. The timeline is documented. The admissions are on the record. Prosecutors do not need to infer intent from silence or circumstantial evidence. They can point directly to sworn testimony. The broader legal community understands what that means. Once intent can be reasonably argued, discretion narrows. Prosecutors are no longer deciding whether something looks improper. They are deciding whether failing to act would signal that constitutional violations at the highest level are tolerable. That is not a comfortable position for any Justice Department. Politically, the fallout is already spreading. Lawmakers who previously avoided direct confrontation are now publicly distancing themselves. Silence has replaced defense. Carefully worded statements have replaced loyalty. That shift matters. Political cover evaporates quickly once legal exposure becomes personal. Bondi now faces a narrowing corridor of options. Cooperation could mitigate risk, but would require acknowledging wrongdoing and potentially implicating others. Fighting invites scrutiny, SOBOAS, and the full force of prosecutorial investigation. Delay only increases exposure because the longer this sits unresolved, the more pressure builds for action. And this is the part that often gets overlooked. Judges, remember, conduct like this. Even if charges are not immediately filed, the reputation damage inside the legal system is lasting. Credibility once lost is rarely restored. Future filings are read skeptically. Arguments are viewed through a harsher lens. Trust once broken does not quietly return. The hearing ended without resolution, but that was never the point. The purpose was to establish facts, lock in testimony, and place responsibility squarely where it belongs. In that sense, it succeeded. The record is now permanent. It can be cited, quoted, challenged, and used. Pam Bondi walked into the Senate Judiciary Committee under pressure. She walked out with something far heavier, a documented constitutional crisis tied directly to her own actions. Whether that leads to indictment, cooperation, or a prolonged legal battle will be decided in the months ahead. But one thing is already settled. This is no longer a political controversy that can be spun away. It is a legal problem with real exposure, real consequences, and no easy exits. And from this point forward, every move she makes will be judged against the record she created under oath.